The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tarmac of Atlanta International Airport's private aviation terminal. Sarah Thompson checked her Rolex watch, 7:15 a.m. Perfect timing. She was exactly 45 minutes early for her scheduled 8 a.m. flight to New York, just as she always preferred. At 35 years old, Sarah had built her tech company, Thompson Digital Solutions, from the ground up. Today marked a significant milestone. She was flying to New York to finalize a $50 million acquisition deal that would expand her company's reach across the East Coast. Her company's success was a testament to her dedication, having started in her garage just 8 years ago. Sarah adjusted her crisp navy Armani suit and grabbed her leather briefcase from her Tesla Model S. The car service driver had already begun unloading her minimal luggage. A single Rimowa carry-on containing 2 days' worth of carefully selected outfits. She never checked bags on private flights. Efficiency was her trademark. The click of her Christian Louboutin heels echoed against the polished floor as she walked toward the terminal entrance. Her natural hair was styled in a neat professional bun, and her makeup was subtle but flawless. Years of experience had taught her the importance of appearance in the corporate world, especially as a black woman in tech. Several other passengers were also arriving for their morning flights. Sarah noticed Mark Chen, a familiar face from Silicon Valley, being warmly greeted by the staff as he entered the terminal. Sandra Williams, a well-known investment banker, wheeled her luggage through the doors without any interruption. The morning routine at the private terminal was running smoothly, for some. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her executive assistant, Jessica. The team in New York had already prepared the conference room for the afternoon meeting, and the legal documents were ready for final review. Everything was falling into place exactly as planned. Sarah smiled, remembering how far she'd come from her days as a junior programmer. As she approached the terminal's entrance, Sarah mentally reviewed her schedule for the day. The flight would take approximately 2 hours. Her driver in New York would meet her at the private terminal, followed by a quick stop at her hotel to freshen up before the 2 p.m. meeting. The contract signing was scheduled for 4 p.m., with a celebratory dinner at 7 p.m. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distinct smell of jet fuel and freshly cut grass from the airport's immaculate landscaping. Sarah could see her chartered Gulfstream G650 being prepared on the tarmac through the terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows. The sight of the sleek aircraft reminded her of her first flight on a private jet just 3 years ago when she closed her first major contract. Other business travelers moved around her, absorbed in their phones or engaged in quiet conversations about markets and meetings. The private terminal had a different energy than the main airport, more subdued, more exclusive, where time and efficiency were valued above all else. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out her flight documents, company ID, and passport, a habit she'd developed over years of travel. Even though she'd flown from this terminal at least 20 times in the past year, she always kept her documentation ready. Experience had taught her to be prepared for anything. Through the windows, she could see the ground crew performing their pre-flight checks on her chartered jet. The pilot and co-pilot had already arrived and were reviewing their flight plans. The flight attendant was likely already aboard, preparing the cabin for her arrival. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to schedule. The terminal's interior was climate-controlled to perfection, a welcome relief from Atlanta's growing morning humidity. The subtle scent of coffee wafted from the executive lounge, where several early morning travelers sat reading newspapers or working on laptops. It was a familiar scene, one Sarah had witnessed countless times before. Little did Sarah know that this routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary. As she stepped toward the security checkpoint, she was about to encounter a situation that would not only test her composure, but would also spark a national conversation about prejudice in private aviation. The events that would unfold over the next hour would transform what should have been a simple business trip into a powerful statement about racial bias in corporate America. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal how success and status sometimes aren't enough to shield someone from the bitter sting of discrimination. But Sarah Thompson was about to prove that she was more than prepared for the challenge ahead. James Miller had been working as a security guard at the private aviation terminal for just 6 months. He stood at his post, a stern expression fixed on his face as he watched Sarah Thompson approach the security checkpoint. His hand immediately moved to rest on his security badge, a habit he'd developed to assert his authority. As Sarah stepped forward with her documentation ready, Miller moved directly into her path, his 6-foot frame creating an imposing barrier. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some additional identification," he announced loudly, causing several nearby travelers to turn their heads. His voice carried a tone that Sarah had heard too many times before in her professional life. Sarah calmly presented her passport, flight documentation, and company ID. "Here you are. I'm the CEO of Thomson Digital Solutions. My flight is scheduled for 8 a.m., she stated professionally, maintaining steady eye contact with Miller. The documents were pristinely organized in her hand, just as they had been for her previous 20 flights from this terminal. Miller barely glanced at the documentation. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to verify these credentials. We've had some security issues lately," he said, despite no such issues having occurred. He made no move to actually examine the documents Sarah held out, instead keeping his arms crossed over his chest. Just then, Richard Parker, a white executive Sarah recognized from previous flights, walked through the checkpoint. Miller gave him a friendly nod and wave, not asking for a single piece of identification. This stark contrast wasn't lost on the other passengers who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. She noticed Miller's nameplate caught the fluorescent lighting above. J. Miller, Security. She mentally noted the name and badge number displayed beneath it, a habit she'd developed from years of corporate strategy. Miller shifted his weight, trying to appear more authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. We need to be thorough with our security checks." He emphasized the word thorough, while continuing to ignore the documentation Sarah had presented. The tension in the terminal grew palpable. A small crowd had gathered, some pretending to check their phones while watching the scene unfold. Sarah noticed several people shaking their heads in disapproval at Miller's obvious discrimination. "Mr. Miller," Sarah began, her voice clear and controlled, "I've flown from this terminal 23 times in the past year alone. I'm a registered client with Elite Aviation Services, and my flight is scheduled and paid for. Would you like to explain why you're requiring additional verification from me when you haven't asked the same of other passengers?" Miller's face reddened slightly, but he stood his ground. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them." His hand tightened on his security badge as he spoke, a nervous tell that didn't escape Sarah's notice. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out her phone. With practiced ease, she opened her camera app and began recording. "Please, Mr. Miller, explain to me exactly which rules you're enforcing. I'd like to understand why I'm being singled out for additional screening." The other travelers had stopped pretending not to watch. A young woman in a business suit was openly recording the interaction on her phone. Two executives Sarah recognized from tech conferences were whispering to each other, their disapproval evident. Miller's confidence began to waver as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Ma'am, if you're going to be difficult, I'll need to call my supervisor," he threatened, reaching for his radio. Sarah smiled slightly, her composure unwavering. "That's an excellent idea, Mr. Miller. In fact, while you're doing that, I'll make a few calls myself." She pulled out a second phone, her business line, and began dialing numbers she knew by heart. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal's windows, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. Sarah stood tall, phones in hand, her expression peaceful but determined. She had faced similar situations before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every person who had ever been profiled or discriminated against in spaces where they belonged. The confrontation was about to escalate, but not in the way Miller expected. Sarah Thompson was prepared to teach everyone present a valuable lesson about power, prejudice, and professionalism. The pattern of discrimination became increasingly obvious as Sarah stood her ground at the security checkpoint. Within the span of 5 minutes, 3 more executives walked through the terminal entrance. Each one received vastly different treatment from Miller compared to Sarah's experience. First came Michael Stevens, a white executive in his 50s, wearing a gray suit that wasn't nearly as well tailored as Sarah's. Miller gave him a friendly wave and said, "Good morning, sir," without asking for any documentation. Stevens walked through, briefcase in hand, without a second glance. Next was Linda Chen, an Asian American investment banker whom Sarah knew from several tech conferences. Miller asked for her basic flight documentation but processed her through quickly with a curt nod. The difference in treatment was noticeable, but not as severe as what Sarah was experiencing. The most telling moment came when David Williams, Sarah's own chief technology officer, entered the terminal. Despite being scheduled on the same flight as Sarah, Miller welcomed him warmly. "Good morning, sir. Heading to New York today?" Miller asked cheerfully, not requesting a single piece of identification from the white executive. David spotted Sarah standing there with her documents still in hand and frowned. He had worked with her for 6 years and knew exactly who she was. "Sarah, is everything okay here?" he asked, walking over to join her. "Mr. Miller here seems to have some concerns about my documentation," Sarah replied calmly, never breaking her professional demeanor. Her phone was still recording, capturing every moment of the unfolding situation. David's face darkened with understanding. "Sarah Thompson is our CEO," he stated firmly to Miller. "We're on the same flight to New York for a major company acquisition." Miller's face flushed red, but he doubled down. "Sir, I still need to follow proper security protocols," he insisted, though these protocols had been conspicuously absent for other passengers. More travelers continued to enter the terminal, and the pattern repeated itself. White passengers walked through with minimal interaction. Passengers of color received varying degrees of scrutiny, but none faced the level of obstruction that Sarah had experienced. A group of younger tech entrepreneurs near the coffee station had stopped their conversation to watch. One of them, a black woman in her 20s, was filming the scene on her phone, her face showing a mix of anger and recognition. She had likely faced similar situations herself. Sarah maintained her composure, but her mind was racing. She noticed how Miller's behavior was creating a perfect case study in discriminatory practices. Each passing minute, each new passenger who entered, added another piece of evidence to the situation. The terminal's regular staff began to look uncomfortable. The coffee shop barista kept glancing nervously at the scene. The receptionist at the front desk was making a phone call, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. Even the cleaning staff had slowed their work to observe the situation. "Mr. Miller," Sarah spoke up, her voice carrying across the now quiet terminal, "I've been standing here for 15 minutes. In that time, you've let through 7 passengers without proper verification. Would you like to explain the criteria you're using to determine who needs additional screening?" Miller shifted his weight uncomfortably, aware that his actions were now under scrutiny from the growing crowd. "Ma'am, as I said, we have procedures." "Yes, procedures," Sarah interrupted smoothly. "I'm very interested in these procedures that seem to apply differently based on the passenger's appearance. Perhaps we should review them together with your supervisor." David, still standing beside Sarah, pulled out his own phone. "I've already contacted our legal department," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're very interested in reviewing this situation." The morning sun had risen higher, casting stark shadows across the terminal floor. The contrast between light and shadow seemed to mirror the clear divide in treatment that everyone had witnessed over the past 15 minutes. Sarah checked her watch again, 7:35 a.m. What should have been a routine check-in had transformed into a dramatic display of bias in action. But Sarah wasn't just fighting for her right to board her flight anymore. She was creating a moment that would force everyone present to confront their own biases and assumptions. The stage was set for what would happen next, as Sarah's carefully documented evidence and professional response were about to bring about consequences that Miller never anticipated when he decided to profile the wrong CEO. Sarah's professional response to Miller's discrimination was a masterclass in handling prejudice with grace. Still recording with one phone, she used her other device to make a series of strategic calls that would change the entire situation. First, she dialed Elite Aviation Services corporate headquarters. "Good morning, this is Sarah Thompson, account number 847,259, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent terminal. "I'm currently being denied access to my scheduled flight by one of your security guards. Despite having complete documentation, I'd like to speak with your chief of operations." Miller's face paled slightly as he realized Sarah wasn't just any passenger. The confidence in her voice, the way she quoted her account number from memory, and her request to speak directly with senior management suggested she was someone with significant influence. While on hold, Sarah opened her email and began typing with one hand. She copied several email addresses, her company's legal team, the aviation company's board of directors, and select media contacts she developed over years of being a tech industry leader. The email's subject line read, "Discriminatory treatment at Elite Aviation. Documentation attached." David, her CTO, was still recording from another angle. Several other passengers had gathered nearby, their phones also capturing the incident. The young black woman who had been filming earlier approached Sarah. "Ms. Thompson, I'm a reporter for Tech Daily. Would you like to make a statement about what's happening here?" Sarah smiled professionally. "Not at this moment, but my PR team will be happy to provide a comprehensive statement later today." Her response was measured, showing she knew exactly how to handle media attention. Miller began to fidget with his radio, clearly unsure how to proceed. The situation had escalated far beyond what he'd expected when he decided to block a black woman from entering the terminal. His previous experiences with discriminatory behavior had likely gone unchallenged, but he'd never encountered someone like Sarah Thompson before. "Mr. Miller," Sarah addressed him calmly, "while we wait for your supervisors, would you like to explain why you haven't asked for additional verification from any white passengers? I counted 12 who've walked through in the past 20 minutes. My phones have recorded each instance." The corporate office representative came back on the line. Sarah put the call on speaker. "Ms. Thompson, we're absolutely horrified by this situation. Our chief of operations is on his way to the terminal now, and we're launching an immediate investigation." Other staff members in the terminal began distancing themselves from Miller. The receptionist who had made the earlier phone call was now openly shaking her head in disapproval. Even the security guard at the other checkpoint had moved away, wanting no association with Miller's actions. Sarah's email inbox pinged with rapid responses. Her legal team confirmed they were documenting everything. The aviation company's board secretary assured her of immediate action. Several media outlets were already requesting interviews about the incident. Through it all, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor. She hadn't raised her voice once, hadn't shown anger, hadn't let Miller's discrimination ruffle her composed exterior. Instead, she had systematically gathered evidence and activated her network of professional connections. "Would anyone else who has experienced similar treatment from this guard please step forward?" Sarah asked the gathered crowd. 3 people immediately moved closer, including a well-known sports agent and a federal judge. Miller's face grew increasingly pale. David stepped closer to Sarah. "Legal says we have enough evidence for a discrimination lawsuit, but they think a public apology and policy change would have more impact," he whispered. Sarah nodded, already thinking several steps ahead. This incident could lead to meaningful changes in how private aviation handled security screening. Her response wasn't just about getting to her flight anymore. It was about ensuring no one else would face similar discrimination. The terminal doors opened, and several men in expensive suits rushed in, looking concerned. From their badges, they were senior management from Elite Aviation. Sarah straightened her jacket slightly, ready to transform this incident of discrimination into an opportunity for corporate change. Miller stood frozen, watching as his simple act of prejudice had transformed into a career-defining moment, though not in the way he had ever imagined. Sarah's professional response had not only highlighted his discrimination, but was about to bring about significant changes in private aviation security protocols. The terminal's atmosphere shifted dramatically as 3 senior executives from Elite Aviation Services rushed through the doors. Leading them was Marcus Richardson, the chief of operations, followed by Linda Martinez, head of security, and James Foster, the company's legal director. Richardson's face showed deep concern as he approached the scene. He'd already watched portions of the recorded footage, sent to him by multiple witnesses via social media. "Miss Thompson," he said, extending his hand, "I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for this situation." Miller stood rigid, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The security guard watched as his superiors gathered around Sarah, their body language showing deference to the CEO he'd been blocking for the past 30 minutes. "Mr. Richardson," Sarah responded professionally, "I appreciate your quick response. However, I'm more interested in discussing how we prevent this from happening to others who might not have my resources or connections." Her words carried weight across the terminal, where several people nodded in agreement. Linda Martinez stepped forward, her face tight with controlled anger. "Officer Miller, surrender your badge and radio immediately. You're placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Her voice was firm and unwavering. As Miller reluctantly removed his security badge, Sarah pulled up some statistics on her phone. "In the past 30 minutes, my team has documented 17 passengers entering this terminal. Of those 17, only people of color were asked for additional verification. That's not a coincidence, Mr. Richardson." The gathered crowd had grown larger. Among them were several high-profile executives who regularly used the terminal. Many were filming the interaction, understanding they were witnessing a significant moment in private aviation history. David, Sarah's CTO, stepped forward with his own documentation. "We've compiled a preliminary report showing similar patterns of discriminatory behavior over the past month, based on witnesses who've come forward in the last half hour." Foster, the legal director, was furiously taking notes on his tablet. The implications of this situation were massive, not just legally, but for the company's reputation in the highly competitive private aviation industry. "Ms. Thompson," Richardson spoke again, "we would very much appreciate the opportunity to work with you on implementing new security protocols and training programs. Your experience and insight would be invaluable." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I believe that would be constructive. My company's diversity and inclusion team would be happy to collaborate with you." She paused, then added, "We can discuss this further in New York. I believe my flight is scheduled to depart in 20 minutes. Miller, who had been standing silently, finally spoke up. "I was just following security protocols." His voice trailed off as Martinez cut him short. "Which protocols exactly, Officer Miller?" Martinez demanded. "Please point out in our security manual where it states we should discriminate based on race." "I'll wait." The sarcasm in her voice was evident. The terminal staff had begun returning to their duties, but their eyes kept darting to the scene. The coffee shop barista was openly smiling now, clearly pleased to see justice being served. The receptionist who had made the initial call to management looked satisfied with the outcome. Richardson turned to address the gathered crowd. "On behalf of Elite Aviation Services, I want to apologize to everyone who has witnessed or experienced discriminatory treatment at our facilities. We will be conducting a full review of our security procedures and implementing immediate changes." Sarah checked her watch again, 7:45 a.m. Despite the delay, she was still on schedule to make her meeting in New York. More importantly, she had turned what could have been just another incident of discrimination into a catalyst for change. "Mr. Richardson," Sarah said, her voice carrying authority, "I look forward to receiving your detailed plan for procedural changes and staff training by the end of the week. My legal team will be in touch to discuss the specifics." As Miller was escorted from the terminal by security, Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to board her flight. The other passengers made way for her, many nodding in respect or offering words of support. She had handled the situation with grace and professionalism, turning a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for institutional change. The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's windows, symbolic of the light Sarah had just shed on a dark practice. She had not just won her own battle. She had paved the way for others who might face similar discrimination in the future. The tables had turned dramatically in the private aviation terminal. Miller, now stripped of his badge and authority, stood to the side with his head down while Sarah Thompson's true identity and influence became increasingly clear to everyone present. "Ms. Thompson," Richardson said, reviewing her documentation, "I see that your company holds our highest tier membership. You've chartered over 50 flights with us in the past year alone." His voice carried a mix of respect and concern, fully aware of what losing such a valuable client could mean for Elite Aviation. Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional composure. "Yes, our company spent approximately $2.8 million on private aviation services last year, with about 60% of that through Elite Aviation." She let the number hang in the air, its significance not lost on anyone present. Miller's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he had profiled and attempted to block was responsible for millions in revenue for his company. His attempt to exercise power over her had backfired spectacularly. Linda Martinez, the head of security, was reviewing the security footage on her tablet. "Ms. Thompson, in the past 30 minutes alone, we documented clear evidence of discriminatory behavior. Officer Miller allowed 23 passengers through with minimal or no screening, while stopping every person of color for additional verification. The growing crowd of onlookers included several prominent business figures who had witnessed the entire scene. Among them was Marcus Chen, CEO of a leading tech startup, who stepped forward. "I've experienced similar treatment here before, but never had the courage to speak up. Ms. Thompson, thank you for taking a stand." Miller attempted to speak again. "I didn't know who she was," but was quickly silenced by James Foster, the legal director. "That's precisely the problem, Miller," Foster snapped. "You shouldn't treat anyone this way, regardless of who they are or how much business they bring to our company." Sarah turned to address Miller directly for the first time since the executives arrived. "Mr. Miller, my identity as a CEO shouldn't matter. The fact that you think it does shows exactly why this discriminatory behavior needs to be addressed systematically." The terminal staff who had watched the scene unfold were now openly supporting Sarah. The coffee shop barista brought over a complimentary cappuccino, while the receptionist approached with information about VIP lounge access. The same people who had stayed quiet during Miller's discrimination were now falling over themselves to make amends. Richardson, sensing the need for immediate action, announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Effective immediately, all security personnel will undergo mandatory anti-bias training. We're also implementing a new reporting system for passengers to document any discriminatory treatment." Sarah checked her phone, noting several incoming messages. News of the incident had already started spreading through social media. Hashtag #aviation bias was trending on Twitter, and several major news outlets were requesting comments. David, her CTO, showed her his tablet. Their company's stock had actually jumped 2 points since the incident began. The market was responding positively to Sarah's handling of the discrimination, seeing it as strong leadership. Miller, still standing to the side with a security escort, watched as his former supervisors gathered around Sarah, discussing immediate policy changes and future collaboration. His attempt to exert power over someone he had prejudged had led to his own downfall and sparked institutional change. "Miss Thompson," Martinez said, "would you be willing to consult with us on our new training protocols? Your perspective would be invaluable." Sarah smiled diplomatically. "Of course, my team will be in touch to schedule a meeting. But first, I believe I have a flight to catch and a company to acquire in New York." The terminal staff quickly began preparing for her departure, treating her with the respect she had deserved from the beginning. As she gathered her belongings, Sarah noticed Miller being escorted toward the exit, his security uniform to be surrendered before leaving the premises. The morning sun now filled the terminal completely, illuminating Sarah as she walked toward her gate, head held high. She had transformed what could have been a humiliating experience into a powerful moment of change. Behind her, Miller's retreating figure served as a reminder that the days of unchecked discrimination were numbered, at least in this terminal. The resolution of the situation unfolded rapidly as a light aviation's management team worked to address the incident. Richardson gathered all available staff members in the terminal's main area while Sarah prepared for her delayed departure. Effective immediately, Richardson announced to his assembled staff, "We are implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Any employee who exhibits bias in their duties will face immediate termination." His voice carried across the terminal, firm and resolute. Linda Martinez was already coordinating with her security team to review all security camera footage from the past 6 months. "We need to identify if this was a pattern of behavior," she explained to Sarah. "Initial reviews suggest Mr. Miller may have been targeting minorities consistently." James Foster, the legal director, approached Sarah with several documents in hand. "Miss Thompson, we drafted an immediate action plan. Would you review it?" The papers outlined comprehensive changes to security protocols, training requirements, and accountability measures. Sarah scanned the documents quickly, her business acumen evident in her rapid assessment. "Add quarterly audits by an independent civil rights organization," she suggested, "and implement an anonymous reporting system for passengers who experience discrimination." The terminal staff watched as their entire security protocol was reorganized in real time. The remaining security guards looked uncomfortable, perhaps reflecting on their own past behaviors that had gone unchallenged. David, who had been monitoring social media, showed Sarah his phone. The incident had gone viral, with hashtag Elite Aviation Accountability trending nationwide. Major news networks were picking up the story, focusing on how a CEO's professional response had sparked immediate corporate change. Ms. Thompson, a young black woman, approached her. "I'm Lisa Johnson from Aviation Weekly. Would you comment on how this incident might influence industry-wide security practices?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. Today's incident highlights the need for standardized, unbiased security protocols across private aviation. Elite Aviation's immediate response shows how companies can turn discriminatory incidents into opportunities for positive change. Richardson, hearing her response, quickly added, "We're establishing a diversity advisory board to oversee our security practices. Ms. Thompson has agreed to be a consulting member." The terminal's atmosphere had transformed completely. The same staff who had watched silently during Miller's discrimination were now actively engaging in discussions about preventing future incidents. The coffee shop staff began distributing free drinks to delayed passengers, while the reception desk processed expedited check-ins. Martinez returned with preliminary findings from her security footage review. "We've identified at least 20 similar incidents in the past month alone. Each case will be reviewed and affected passengers will receive formal apologies and compensation." Sarah checked her watch again, 7:50 a.m. Despite the delay, her pilot had confirmed they could still make up time in the air to reach New York for her important meeting. The incident had served a greater purpose than just addressing one security guard's bias. Foster approached with updated documents. "We've incorporated your suggestions, Ms. Thompson. The independent audits will begin next week, and the anonymous reporting system will be online by tomorrow." The remaining passengers in the terminal, many of whom had delayed their own departures to witness the resolution, began applauding as Sarah prepared to board her flight. Their spontaneous show of support highlighted how one person's professional response to discrimination could inspire others. "Before I depart," Sarah addressed the gathered crowd, "I want to emphasize that this incident isn't about one security guard or one company. It's about acknowledging systemic bias and taking concrete steps to address it. Elite Aviation's response today sets a new standard for corporate accountability." Richardson nodded in agreement. "We're grateful for Ms. Thompson's leadership in helping us address this issue. Our commitment to unbiased service starts today." As Sarah finally walked toward her gate, accompanied by Elite Aviation's executives, she noticed several security guards removing their badges to attend the immediately scheduled sensitivity training. The incident had sparked immediate, tangible change. David matched her stride, showing her more incoming messages. Other aviation companies were already announcing reviews of their own security practices, not wanting to risk similar incidents at their facilities. The morning's confrontation had evolved from a simple case of discrimination into a catalyst for industry-wide change. Sarah's professional handling of the situation had not only addressed the immediate issue, but had set in motion changes that would benefit countless future travelers. The impact of Sarah Thompson's encounter with James Miller at Elite Aviation's terminal continued to ripple through the private aviation industry long after her flight departed for New York. The incident, which had begun as one security guard's discriminatory actions, transformed into a watershed moment for corporate accountability. 1 week after the incident, Sarah's LinkedIn post about her experience went viral, garnering over 2 million views in just 24 hours. Her professional response to discrimination became a case study at several leading business schools, teaching future executives how to handle bias while maintaining composure. Elite Aviation stock initially dropped 3% when the news first broke, but rebounded and climbed 12% after investors responded positively to their swift and comprehensive changes. The company's new anti-discrimination policies, developed in consultation with Sarah's team, became a model for the entire aviation industry. James Miller's story took an unexpected turn. After his termination, he reached out to Sarah through her company's HR department, requesting a meeting. To everyone's surprise, Sarah agreed. During their conversation, Miller apologized sincerely and admitted his unconscious biases. Sarah offered him an opportunity to participate in her company's diversity training program as a case study of how bias can affect decision-making. Sometimes, Sarah told her executive team, the best way to create change is to transform your opponents into allies. Miller's journey from discriminatory security guard to anti-bias advocate became another powerful chapter in the story. The terminal where the incident occurred underwent a complete cultural transformation. Elite Aviation installed new security protocols that required all screening decisions to be documented and reviewed. Security cameras now monitored the screening process, with quarterly audits by independent civil rights organizations ensuring fairness. Sarah's company, Thomson Digital Solutions, saw unexpected benefits from the incident. Their handling of the situation attracted new clients who valued strong leadership and social responsibility. The company's commitment to fighting discrimination led to several government contracts focused on developing AI systems for unbiased security screening. 3 months after the incident, Aviation Weekly magazine featured Sarah on its cover. The headline read, "Transforming Discrimination into Progress: How One CEO's Response Changed Private Aviation." The article detailed how her professional handling of bias had sparked industry-wide reforms. David, her loyal CTO, helped implement a new app that allowed travelers to report discriminatory treatment at any aviation facility anonymously. The app, called Fair Flight, was downloaded over 100,000 times in its first month, creating accountability across the industry. The young black reporter who had witnessed the incident, Lisa Johnson, wrote a series of articles examining discrimination in private aviation. Her work won a prestigious journalism award and led to congressional hearings on bias in transportation security. Elite Aviation's new training program, developed with input from Sarah's team, became mandatory across all private aviation companies in the United States. The program emphasized that VIP treatment shouldn't depend on recognizing someone's status, but should be standard for all passengers. 1 year after the incident, Sarah returned to the same terminal for another flight. The change was remarkable. The security staff was diverse, well-trained, and professional. The screening process was consistent for all passengers, regardless of their appearance or status. The terminal had installed a small plaque near the security checkpoint. It read, "Commitment to equality. Every passenger deserves respect, dignity, and fair treatment. Our security procedures reflect this fundamental truth." Miller, who had completed the diversity training program, was now giving talks at aviation security conferences about recognizing and overcoming bias. His transformation from perpetrator to advocate demonstrated how accountability could lead to genuine change. Sarah's story became required reading in corporate training programs across America. Business leaders studied how she had maintained professionalism while confronting discrimination, and how she had used her influence to create lasting change rather than simply punishing the offender. The final measure of impact came from the numbers. Reported incidents of discrimination in private aviation dropped by 87% over the following year. Elite Aviation's new protocols were adopted by international aviation authorities, creating a global standard for unbiased security screening. As Sarah reflected on the incident during an interview for Harvard Business Review, she smiled. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes," she said. "It's not about who you prove wrong, it's about what you prove right." The story of how one CEO's professional response to discrimination transformed an industry continued to inspire others to stand up against bias, proving that real change often begins with one person's dignified refusal to accept injustice.